Okay, so imagine you inherit a house,
Yeah.
right? And it's just crammed with gadgets,
Oh, wow.
but like outdated gadgets.
Uh-oh.
We're talking like a rotary phone that only seems to connect to telemarketers.
Uh-huh.
A Betamax player with like a single moldy tape. And like a bread maker that's permanently stuck in dough mode.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture.
Quirky, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But helpful. Not so much.
Not really.
And it turns out that this is pretty much the situation that many companies are dealing with when it comes to their legacy applications.
Yeah, it's a surprisingly common problem, actually. And as technology keeps evolving at this crazy pace, it's only getting worse.
Right, exactly. So in this deep dive, we are tackling how to shift our thinking
Okay.
to start treating these applications as assets with actual life cycles,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to retiring the ones that have maybe outlived their usefulness.
And that shift in thinking, I think, requires a corresponding shift in skills and job roles as well. We're going to need people with expertise in areas like cloud migration, AI-driven assessment, and data architecture to really effectively manage that entire application lifecycle.
That is such a good point. It's not just about the technology, it's about the people and the processes too.
Right.
But first, let's get a sense of just how big this problem really is.
Okay.
Our source material actually mentions a Fortune 500 manufacturer that discovered they were maintaining 3 times
Wow.
the applications they actually needed.
Ouch. That's a recipe for a budget bloat and a whole bunch of IT headaches.
And it really highlights how those application portfolios can spiral out of control without a conscious strategy for managing them.
Absolutely.
And the source outlines 4 key forces driving this application portfolio expansion. The first one is what they call acquisition inertia. Have you ever seen this in action?
Countless times. I mean, think about mergers and acquisitions. Companies inherit each other's applications, and all of a sudden there's just a ton of redundancy. But integrating those systems is often way more expensive than just replacing them. So companies kind of end up stuck with this bloated portfolio.
It's like suddenly having 2 kitchens.
Right?
Right.
Exactly.
You could keep both, but who needs the extra space and the hassle?
Exactly. It's about making those strategic decisions about what to keep, what to integrate, and what to retire.
Okay.
And that actually brings us to the second force, which is innovation without retirement.
Ah, yes. The allure of the shiny new app.
Right.
Everyone's so excited about the latest and greatest, but nobody wants to deal with the old, outdated systems.
Yeah, it's a classic case of out of sight, out of mind.
Really?
But those neglected applications, they don't just disappear. They're lingering in the background, consuming resources and creating security risks.
Right. And then you've got departments going rogue with their own cloud solutions, what the source calls shadow IT proliferation. They're looking for those quick solutions, but they end up creating a security and compliance nightmare.
Yeah, shadow IT is a huge challenge for organizations because you have no control over the security of those unsanctioned applications, and they often create data silos that make it really difficult to get a complete picture of your business operations.
And finally, there's the dreaded technical debt accumulation.
Yes.
Aging applications are demanding costly maintenance, and the people with the specialized skills to keep them running are becoming harder and harder to find.
It's a ticking time bomb for many organizations, clinging to those outdated applications because they seem indispensable versus strategically decommissioning them for cost savings and agility.
Okay.
This is where treating applications as assets with life cycles comes in, recognizing that applications have a lifespan and just like any other asset, eventually reach a point where they need to be retired.
Okay, so how do we actually go about assessing which applications are ready for retirement? The source material mentions 4 dimensions of application assessment.
Okay.
The first one being technical health.
Right. Technical health is all about looking under the hood of the application. Is the architecture current? How much technical debt has accumulated? Is it secure? Is it performing well?
It's like a car, right? A classic car might be cool to look at.
Sure.
But if it's constantly breaking down and costing a fortune in repairs, it might be time to trade it in.
Exactly. And that brings us to the second dimension, which is business value.
Okay.
Does this application actually drive revenue, or is it draining resources? How critical is it to core processes?
Right, because an application might be technically sound, but just not be relevant to the business anymore.
Exactly.
It's about making sure that the technology supports business goals, not the other way around.
Exactly. And the third dimension is operational impact. This is where we look at the day-to-day realities of keeping the application running.
Okay.
How much effort goes into maintaining it? How complex is the support? What's the data management like? Is the documentation up to date?
So it's about understanding the burden that this application is placing on the IT team and on the organization as a whole.
Precisely.
Mm.
And finally, there's risk and compliance.
Yeah.
Does this application meet regulatory requirements? How vulnerable is it to security threats? How exposed are we to potential data breaches?
Yikes. Those are some scary questions. It's about assessing the potential downsides of keeping this application around.
Right. And here's where things get really interesting. The source material emphasizes the importance of continuous assessment.
Okay.
It's not enough to just do this once and call it a day.
It's like a regular checkup.
Exactly, like a regular checkup for your application portfolio.
I like that.
And they share a chilling case study here. A global retailer who lost critical data during a poorly planned retirement.
Oh, no. How much did that cost them?
A whopping $12 million.
Wow. That really highlights the need for a well-defined process, especially when it comes to data migration and archival. We can't just hit delete and hope for the best.
Absolutely. Before we even think about decommissioning an application, we need to understand what data is truly vital, what retention policies are in place, and how to choose the right storage solution to balance access needs, costs, and security.
And I love the way the source breaks this down into what they call the 4 pillars of data management.
Okay, let's hear it.
All right, so first up we have classification and governance.
Okay.
What data is truly vital? What are the retention policies? What are our legal obligations?
Those are crucial questions. And then there's archive architecture. Choosing the right storage solution is essential: on-premise cloud or a hybrid approach. It all depends on the data and the organization's needs.
Right, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Not at all.
Okay, and then we have the migration strategy itself.
Yes.
And this is where it gets really complex with data mapping, transformation validation, making sure that everything gets moved correctly and nothing gets lost in the process.
It's definitely more complicated than just copying and pasting.
Mm.
And that complexity, I think, really underscores the need for specialized skills in data architecture. It's a critical role in the modern application lifecycle management process.
Absolutely. And finally, we have quality assurance.
Yes.
We need rigorous checks to ensure data integrity, accessibility, and performance after the migration.
Think of it like moving an entire library.
Okay.
You've got to categorize everything, pack carefully, make sure everything is in the right place on those new shelves, and that nothing gets lost or damaged in the process.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
But even with the perfect technical plan, there's still the human element to consider, right?
Absolutely. Decommissioning isn't just about the technology. It's about managing change and helping users through the transition.
Okay.
We need to address potential workflow disruptions, stakeholder psychology, those anxieties about data loss or attachment to old systems.
Right, because people get comfortable with their routines,
They do.
and change can be unsettling.
It's natural. And then there's the issue of knowledge transfer.
Okay.
We need to capture that tribal knowledge before experts retire, document new processes thoroughly. We can't let valuable expertise just disappear with those old systems.
And the source material highlights the importance of cultural adaptation as well.
Yes.
Teams might need to adjust their communication and collaboration styles with the new system.
Absolutely.
This is where strong leadership and effective change management come into play.
Leaders need to champion the change, communicate clearly, and provide the necessary support and training to help users adapt.
And speaking of support, the source mentions a healthcare provider that had a whopping 45% of their staff's time
Wow.
dedicated to maintaining legacy systems.
That's mind-boggling.
Imagine the potential if they'd embraced decommissioning sooner.
The resources tied up in maintaining those outdated systems could be freed up for so many more valuable activities, like innovation or improving patient care in this case.
Right. And speaking of the future, our source points to some exciting trends on the horizon: cloud migration, AI-driven assessment, and modern architecture patterns. These are transforming decommissioning from a one-time event into a process of continuous evolution.
It's an exciting time to be in this field. We're seeing a convergence of technology and strategy that's revolutionizing the way organizations manage their applications.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges of legacy systems and the importance of treating applications as assets with life cycles.
Right.
But how do we actually measure the business value of an application? How do we know if it's worth keeping or if it's time to say goodbye?
That's a great question, and one that often gets overlooked. Luckily, our source material provides a great framework for tackling this. They stress that not all applications are created equal.
Okay.
Some drive revenue, others just seem to exist.
Right, like that bread maker stuck in dough mode.
Exactly. So how do we actually go about measuring business value?
Yeah, how do we do that?
Well, the source outlines a comprehensive framework for business value analysis. It considers several key factors: usage intensity, process criticality, strategic alignment, and cost-benefit ratio.
Okay.
By analyzing an application across these dimensions, we can get a clear picture of its value to the organization.
Okay, let's break those down. First up, usage intensity. How do we actually measure that?
Usage intensity is all about understanding how actively an application is being used within an organization. We're looking at metrics like daily and monthly active users, user engagement scores, and usage trends over time.
So if an application has very low usage, that's a red flag, right?
It could be redundant, underutilized, or just not meeting its users' needs.
Okay.
But of course, we need to consider the context. A specialized application might have low overall usage, but be absolutely crucial for a specific team or function.
That's a great point. Context is everything.
Yeah.
Okay, what about process criticality?
This is where we determine how essential an application is to the core processes of the business.
Okay.
Does it support revenue generation, customer experience, or regulatory compliance? Or is it supporting a less critical function like internal operations or reporting?
And the more critical the process, the higher the business value of the application supporting it.
Precisely. If an application plays a vital role in a core business process, its value is inherently higher. And that leads us to strategic alignment.
Okay, so this is about how well an application aligns with the overall direction of the organization.
You got it.
It's like if a company is moving towards a cloud-first strategy, an on-premise application might not be a good fit even if it's still functional.
Exactly. We need to evaluate the application against the organization's digital transformation goals, business objectives, technology roadmap, and innovation priorities. Is it supporting where the organization is headed, or is it holding it back?
And that alignment becomes even more critical as organizations embrace those digital transformation initiatives.
Absolutely. In today's rapidly changing business environment, technology needs to be an enabler, not a constraint. And that brings us to the final factor, cost-benefit ratio.
Okay, let's talk dollars and cents.
Right.
What kinds of costs are we considering?
We're looking at infrastructure costs, licensing fees, support costs, and even those sneaky opportunity costs. What could we be doing with the resources we're spending on this application if we weren't tied to it?
Right, because maintaining an outdated application isn't just about the direct costs, it's also about those missed opportunities.
Exactly. And on the benefit side, we're analyzing things like revenue impact efficiency, gains risk reduction, even customer satisfaction. Essentially, what value is this application bringing to the table?
So we're weighing those costs against the benefits to get a clear picture of the application's financial viability.
Right. And the source mentions a business value score,
Okay.
a comprehensive metric that combines all these elements into a single actionable number. Think of it like a credit score for your applications.
So this score can help us prioritize applications and make decisions about their future.
Exactly.
Like if an application has a low business value score, it's a good candidate for retirement.
Exactly. It provides a data-driven approach to determine which applications are worth investing in and which ones should be considered for retirement or replacement.
Okay, this all makes sense, but let's be real. How often are companies actually doing this level of analysis?
Unfortunately, it's still more the exception than the rule. But the case studies in our source show the huge benefits organizations can gain when they embrace this strategic approach to application management. They highlight real-world examples of companies that have streamlined their portfolios, reduced costs, and freed up resources for innovation simply by taking this more strategic, data-driven approach.
It's like they're finally cleaning out that overstuffed closet and realizing they have way more space and potential than they thought.
That's a great way to put it. But let's not forget, even with a clear framework for measuring business value, there are still challenges. Gathering accurate data can be difficult, and there can be resistance to change.
Especially from those folks who are really attached to their old familiar systems.
Right. But with buy-in from leadership, the right tools, and a solid change management strategy, those challenges can be overcome. The key is to see the long-term benefits and to communicate those benefits effectively to everyone involved.
Okay, so we've established that assessing business value is crucial. But what about the technical health of these applications? How do we evaluate that?
Another excellent question. After all, an application could have high business value, but be a technical nightmare to maintain. We need to take a deep dive into the technical aspects to make a fully informed decision.
So where do we even begin? It seems like there's a lot to consider.
That's where a systematic framework comes in handy. Our source material outlines a comprehensive approach to technical health assessment, breaking it down into 5 key dimensions: architecture currency, technical debt load, security, posture, performance profile, and integration complexity.
Okay.
Each dimension is scored, giving you an overall picture of the application's technical health.
Okay, let's unpack those dimensions one by one.
Okay.
First up, architecture currency. What are we looking at here?
We're essentially assessing how up-to-date the application's architecture is. Is it built on modern technologies and frameworks, or is it showing its age? We also look at how well the application aligns with current architectural best practices.
So an application built on outdated technology would score lower in this dimension.
Exactly. It might technically work, but it's going to be slow, inefficient, and prone to problems. It's like trying to run a modern video game on a computer from the 90s.
Ouch, yeah, that's not going to end well. And a modern application built on a microservices architecture, for example, would score higher.
Absolutely. Microservices architecture promotes flexibility, scalability, and resilience, all essential qualities in today's digital landscape.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's move on to the next dimension, technical debt load. Now, I hear this term thrown around a lot, but it can be a bit fuzzy. How do we actually quantify technical debt?
That's a great question. It can be tricky, but our source provides a formula for calculating a debt score.
Okay.
It considers things like code quality metrics, documentation gaps, test coverage, architecture violations, and even the age of the technology stack.
So it's essentially a measure of how much rework would be required to bring the application up to modern standards.
Precisely. The higher the technical debt, the more effort and resources it'll take to modernize the application. And if the debt is significant enough, it might make more sense to retire the application altogether and invest in a more modern solution.
Right, because that debt can really accumulate over time and become a burden on the organization.
Exactly. It's like carrying around a heavy backpack full of unnecessary items. At first, you might not even notice the weight, but over time, it starts to slow you down and make it harder to move forward.
And this is where things like automated testing and continuous integration come in right,
Absolutely.
helping prevent that technical debt from accumulating in the first place.
Those practices are essential for maintaining a healthy code base and reducing technical debt. But even with the best practices in place, some level of technical debt is inevitable. The key is to manage it effectively and address it before it becomes unmanageable.
Okay, so we've covered architecture currency and technical debt load. Let's move on to security posture. What are the key indicators we're looking at here?
This is all about assessing the application's vulnerability to security threats. We're analyzing things like the number of known vulnerabilities, availability of security patches, strengths of authentication methods, measures in place to protect sensitive data, and compliance status with relevant security standards.
So we're basically evaluating how well the application is protected from those increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks and data breaches.
Exactly. And this dimension is particularly important when considering applications that handle sensitive data, like financial information or personal health records.
Okay, let's move on to performance profile. What are we measuring here?
We're evaluating the application's efficiency and reliability. Key performance metrics include response time, throughput, resource utilization, and scalability. Essentially, how quickly does the application respond to user requests? Can it handle peak loads? How well does it scale as the organization grows?
So an application that is slow, prone to errors, and struggles to handle those peak loads would score poorly in this dimension.
Exactly. Those performance issues can have a major impact on user productivity and satisfaction, ultimately affecting the organization's bottom line.
And lastly, we have integration complexity. What's the focus here?
We're assessing how complex and challenging it is to integrate the application with other systems in the organization's IT landscape. We're looking at the number of dependencies, the types of interfaces used, and the overall complexity of the data flows.
So an application that relies on outdated interfaces and has a ton of complex dependencies would score higher in this dimension.
Right. A high score in integration complexity can indicate that the application is difficult and costly to maintain and could be a bottleneck to future innovation.
So once we've evaluated an application across these 5 dimensions, what's next?
All the scores are combined to produce an overall technical health score.
Okay.
This score paints a clear picture of the application's current technical state, informing decisions about maintenance upgrades or potential retirement.
So if an application scores poorly, it might be a candidate for decommissioning.
Exactly. If an application is deemed to be in poor technical health, it might make more sense to retire it and invest in a more modern and sustainable solution.
Okay, so we've got this score. Is there like a benchmark for what's considered good or bad?
The source provides some score ranges and interpretations.
Yeah, okay.
For example, a score of 90 to 100 indicates excellent technical health, while a score of 0 to 49 suggests immediate attention and a major overhaul are needed.
But those benchmarks might vary depending on the organization and its industry, right?
Absolutely. What's considered good for a stable legacy application in a traditional industry might be considered poor for a cutting-edge application in a fast-moving tech company.
Right. Context is key. So we have this technical health score. Now what? How do we translate that score into action?
Well, the source outlines an action framework based on the score. This framework has three main components: immediate actions, short-term strategy, and long-term strategy.
Okay, let's break those down.
Okay.
Starting with immediate actions, what falls into this category?
Think of immediate actions as triage. We're addressing critical issues that require immediate attention, like patching security vulnerabilities, fixing major bugs that are impacting users, or addressing performance bottlenecks that are causing system instability.
So these are the things we do to stop the bleeding.
Exactly. We're stabilizing the patient before we develop a long-term treatment plan.
Okay, what about short-term strategy?
The short-term strategy focuses on improvements that can be implemented relatively quickly, typically within a few months. Think of it as rehabilitation. We might refactor parts of the code to improve maintainability, update outdated libraries, or improve test coverage to reduce the risk of introducing new bugs.
So these are the steps we take to stabilize the application and get it into better shape for the long haul.
Precisely. And then we have a long-term strategy where we plan for more significant improvements or replacements over an extended period. This could involve modernizing the architecture, migrating to new technologies, or redesigning problematic features.
So we're thinking about the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
And how this application fits into the organization's long-term IT strategy. And that might even involve making the tough decision to retire the application altogether.
Exactly. Sometimes the most strategic decision is to retire an application gracefully and invest in a solution that is better aligned with the organization's future needs.
Okay, so this assessment process, it's not a one-time thing.
Absolutely not. Technology is constantly evolving, business needs are changing, security threats are becoming more sophisticated. Regular assessments like an annual checkup are essential to stay ahead of the curve.
Makes sense. But we've talked about the challenges of gathering accurate data for these assessments. Any tips on how to overcome those hurdles?
Having the right tools and processes in place is crucial. Application portfolio management, APM software, can automate many of the data collection tasks, making the process more efficient and accurate.
So APM, that's basically software that helps us manage all of our applications.
Exactly. It's like having a central dashboard for tracking all your applications, their performance, their costs, their risks, and their alignment with business goals.
Okay. And involving the right stakeholders in the assessment process can be helpful too, right?
Absolutely. You need both technical and business stakeholders at the table to get a complete picture of the application's health and its value to the organization. It's a team effort.
Okay, so we've talked about assessing business value and technical health. But there's another critical dimension to consider, isn't there? Risk and compliance.
You got it.
Yeah.
We can't forget about the potential downsides of keeping an application. We need to evaluate the risks associated with security vulnerabilities, data breaches, and compliance violations. It's about protecting the organization and its stakeholders.
So where do we even begin with this risk assessment?
Luckily, our source provides a risk and compliance evaluation framework.
Okay.
This framework breaks down the assessment into 5 key areas: regulatory compliance, business continuity, vendor risk, data security, and audit findings.
Okay.
Each area is carefully evaluated, and the results are combined to generate an overall risk and compliance score.
Okay, let's walk through those 5 areas. First up, regulatory compliance. What are the key considerations here?
This is all about making sure the application meets all relevant regulatory requirements, including data privacy laws like GDPR, industry-specific regulations, and regional requirements.
So, for example, an application that handles personal data would need to comply with those strict GDPR regulations.
Exactly. And an application used in the healthcare industry would need to comply with HIPAA regulations and so on. Failing to meet these requirements can result in hefty fines and reputational damage.
Okay, compliance is clearly critical.
Yeah.
What about business continuity? What are we looking at here?
We're assessing the application's resilience in the face of disruption.
Okay.
How prepared is the organization to maintain operations if the application experiences downtime or a data loss event? Do they have robust disaster recovery plans in place?
So this is about making sure the business can keep running even if the application goes down.
Exactly. It's about having backup systems and recovery processes in place to minimize the impact of any disruption. Think of it like having a spare tire in your car. You might not need it every day, but when you do, you're really glad you have it.
Right. Okay, what about vendor risk? What are the key considerations here?
Here we're assessing the risks associated with any third-party vendors involved in the development support or hosting of the application.
Okay.
Are these vendors reputable and financially stable? Do they have strong security practices? Are their contracts well-defined and favorable to the organization?
So we're looking at how much we trust these vendors and any potential risks they might pose to the organization.
Exactly. You don't want to rely on a vendor with a history of security breaches or one that might suddenly go out of business, leaving you high and dry.
Right. That would be a disaster.
Ah.
Okay, next up we have data security.
Yeah.
What are the key aspects to consider here?
We're assessing how well the application protects sensitive data from unauthorized access, use disclosure, disruption modification, or destruction. We look at things like data classification, access controls, encryption standards, vulnerability management, and incident response processes.
So basically, how robust are the safeguards in place to protect that data?
Right. We're living in an age of increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks, and data breaches can be devastating. We need to be proactive in our approach to data security. And that brings us to the final area, audit findings.
Okay, so audit findings, what are we looking at here?
We're reviewing the results of any recent audits conducted on the application.
Right.
Have any significant vulnerabilities or compliance issues been identified? And if so, how have they been addressed?
So we're looking at the application's track record when it comes to security and compliance.
You got it. It's one thing to have strong policies and procedures, but we need to make sure those policies and procedures are actually being followed in practice. Audits help us identify any gaps and take corrective action.
And I imagine this area is particularly important when dealing with regulated industries where compliance audits are mandatory.
Absolutely. In those industries, audit findings can have serious legal and financial consequences. So it's not something to be taken lightly.
So once we've evaluated the application across these 5 risk and compliance dimensions, what's next?
Well, those scores are combined with any audit findings to produce an overall risk and compliance score. This score gives organizations a clear picture of the application's risk profile, which then informs decisions about mitigation strategies, security investments, or even potential decommissioning.
So an application with a high-risk score might be a prime candidate for retirement.
That's right. If an application poses a significant risk to the organization, it might be more sensible to retire it and invest in a more secure and compliant solution.
Okay, but what if the application can't be decommissioned right away? What if it's still critical to the business?
That's when the organization needs a plan to mitigate those risks and bring the application into compliance. This might involve strengthening security controls, implementing data loss prevention measures, or updating contracts with third-party vendors.
So it's not just about decommissioning, it's also about managing the risk of the applications we decide to keep.
Exactly. And that brings us to one of the most crucial aspects of decommissioning: data migration and archival.
Ah, yes, back to that library analogy.
Yeah.
We need to figure out what to do with all that data when an application is retired.
Right. And this is not a trivial task. Data migration and archival are complex processes that require careful planning and execution.
So where do we begin?
Our source material provides a helpful framework breaking down the process into 4 key pillars: classification and governance, archive architecture, migration strategy, and quality assurance.
Okay, let's unpack those pillars one by one.
Okay.
Starting with classification and governance. What are the key considerations here?
This is where we answer 2 fundamental questions. What data is truly vital? And what are our obligations for retaining that data? We need to understand the legal, regulatory, and business requirements for data retention, as well as classify data based on its sensitivity and importance. This lays the foundation for all subsequent decisions about archiving and managing the data.
So it's like sorting through your belongings before a move. You need to decide what's worth keeping, what can be tossed, and what needs special care.
Exactly. We're categorizing the data and figuring out how long we need to keep it. And that leads us to archive architecture, where we decide where and how this data will be stored after the application is retired.
So are we talking about on-premises storage, cloud storage, or a hybrid approach?
It depends on the data's specific requirements and the organization's needs. On-premises storage can be good for frequently accessed data or data subject to strict security regulations. Cloud storage can be more cost-effective and scalable for less frequently accessed data, and a hybrid approach can offer the best of both worlds.
Right, and I imagine cost is a major factor in this decision.
Absolutely. Storage costs can add up quickly, so it's crucial to choose a solution that meets the organization's needs without breaking the bank. And that brings us to migration strategy. the heart of the data migration process.
Okay, so this is where we plan the actual transfer of the data.
Exactly. We need to consider data mapping, complexity transformation requirements, and quality validation processes. It's a complex dance, carefully mapping data from the source system to the target archive, transforming the data as needed to ensure compatibility, and thoroughly validating the data to ensure accuracy and completeness.
So it's more than just copying and pasting files.
Way more. There's a lot that can go wrong, so careful planning and execution are essential. And that brings us to our final pillar, quality assurance.
Right. We need to make sure all that data was migrated correctly and that it's accessible when we need it.
Precisely. Quality assurance is all about verifying that the migrated data is accurate, complete, and accessible. We conduct data integrity checks, verify access performance tests, and validate compliance. It's like doing a final walkthrough of that new apartment to make sure everything is in order before you settle in.
Okay, so we've moved all the data. What happens to it then?
Well, that depends on the organization's data retention policies and the data's specific requirements. Some data might need to be kept for a specific period due to legal or regulatory reasons, while other data might be archived indefinitely for historical or research purposes. The key is to have a clear plan in place for managing the archived data throughout its entire life cycle.
Right. We don't want to just dump the data in some digital basement and forget about it. We need to be able to access it and use it if we need to.
Exactly. And that's where things like data indexing, search capabilities, and user-friendly interfaces come into play. The easier it is to access and use the archived data, the more valuable it can be to the organization.
So we've covered data migration and archival quite thoroughly. Are there any other key aspects of the decommissioning process we should touch on?
There's one often overlooked aspect, the impact of decommissioning on integrations with other systems.
Right, because applications rarely exist in isolation.
They don't.
They're interconnected, and those connections need to be carefully managed during the decommissioning process.
Exactly. Before decommissioning, you need to identify all integrated systems and assess the potential impact. You might need to update APIs, reroute data flows, or implement temporary workarounds to ensure a smooth transition.
And I imagine this can be complex and time-consuming, especially for older applications with numerous integrations.
Absolutely, but it's crucial. Failing to properly manage integrations can lead to data inconsistencies, system errors, and even disruptions to those critical business processes.
Right, so it's clear decommissioning is more than just flipping a switch and shutting something down.
It's definitely a multifaceted process that requires careful planning, coordination, and execution. It's not just an IT issue, it's a strategic one.
I love that you said that. It's about aligning technology investments with business goals and making sure our technology landscape is supporting the overall strategic direction.
Precisely. And that alignment is even more critical in today's dynamic business environment where agility and adaptability are key to success.
Okay, so let's say an organization wants to get started with decommissioning. Where do they even begin?
A great starting point is to take inventory of all applications in use. Understand what you have, who owns it, how it's being used, and what it costs to maintain.
Right, because you can't manage what you don't measure.
Exactly. Once you have that inventory, you can start assessing each application's business value, technical health, and risk profile using the frameworks we discussed.
Then you can prioritize applications for decommissioning based on those assessments, right?
Precisely. Applications that are costly to maintain, deliver little business value, or pose a significant risk should be at the top of the list.
Okay, so once you've identified those prime candidates for retirement, what's next?
That's where the decommissioning plan comes in. This plan outlines all the steps involved in actually retiring the application, the timeline for completion, the resources required, and the strategies for mitigating any potential risks.
So it's like a detailed roadmap for the entire decommissioning process.
Exactly. We need to map out the route, carefully consider any potential detours, and make sure we have all the resources and support we need to reach our destination.
And communication is key throughout this journey, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We need to keep all stakeholders informed throughout the entire decommissioning process. This includes users, business owners, IT staff, and even those external vendors.
Right. We want to avoid any surprises or disruptions along the way.
Exactly. A well-executed decommissioning process should be seamless and transparent to the organization.
It sounds like decommissioning is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process.
That's right. It's an ongoing cycle of assessment, prioritization, planning, and execution. And as technology continues to evolve at this ever-increasing pace, this process is only going to become more important.
Absolutely. So let's shift gears now and talk about the future. What are some of the emerging trends and technologies that are shaping the decommissioning landscape?
That's a great question, and it's an area where we're seeing a lot of innovation and excitement. One of the biggest trends is the increasing adoption of cloud computing.
Right, because cloud migration offers so many potential benefits when it comes to decommissioning.
Exactly. Cloud platforms provide a flexible and scalable infrastructure that makes it much easier to decommission those on-premise applications and move their functionality to the cloud.
And the cloud can simplify data migration and archival too, right?
Absolutely. Cloud storage solutions offer a range of options for storing and managing that archive data, and they can be much more cost-effective than traditional on-premise storage solutions.
So cloud migration is definitely a trend to watch in the decommissioning space. What else is on the horizon?
Another trend gaining momentum is the use of artificial intelligence, AI, and automation in the decommissioning process.
AI and automation. How are those being applied to decommissioning?
AI can automate many of the tasks involved in application assessment and prioritization. For example, AI algorithms can analyze application usage, data performance metrics, and security logs to pinpoint applications that are good candidates for decommissioning.
So AI can help us make more data-driven decisions about which applications to retire.
Exactly. And AI can also help automate many of the tasks involved in data migration and archival. For example, AI algorithms can be used to identify and classify sensitive data, map data from the source system to the target archive, and even transform data as needed to ensure compatibility.
So AI can help us streamline the data migration process and reduce the risk of errors.
Exactly. And then we have automation, which can handle many of the manual tasks involved in decommissioning, such as shutting down servers, updating integrations, and notifying users.
It sounds like AI and automation are really changing the game when it comes to decommissioning. What other trends are you seeing?
Well, another trend having a big impact is the adoption of modern architecture patterns, such as microservices and containers. These patterns promote modularity and flexibility, making it easier to decommission or replace individual components of an application without impacting the whole system.
So instead of decommissioning an entire monolithic application, you can just decommission or replace the parts that are no longer needed or causing problems.
Exactly. And this significantly reduces the risk and complexity of decommissioning. It also allows organizations to take a more agile and iterative approach to application management where they can continuously evolve and improve their systems over time.
So it sounds like the future of decommissioning is less about retirement and more about continuous transformation.
That's a great way to put it. Applications are no longer static entities with a fixed lifespan. They're dynamic systems that need to be constantly adapted and evolved to meet changing business needs and technological advancements.
And decommissioning is becoming an integral part of that continuous transformation process.
Exactly. It's no longer an afterthought or a last resort. It's a strategic tool that organizations can use to optimize their IT landscapes, reduce costs, and drive innovation.
Okay, so as we wrap up our discussion on the future of decommissioning, what's a key takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they look ahead?
I think the key takeaway is that decommissioning is no longer just about getting rid of old technology. It's about strategically managing the entire application lifecycle to ensure that technology investments are aligned with business goals and that the organization's IT landscape is supporting its overall strategic direction.
And as technology keeps evolving at this rapid pace, this strategic approach to decommissioning is only going to become more crucial.
Absolutely. Organizations that embrace decommissioning as an ongoing process will be much better equipped to navigate the complexities of the digital landscape and achieve their business goals.
Okay, we've talked about assessing business value, technical health risk, data migration, and the future of decommissioning. But what about the people involved? How do we effectively manage the change for users when we retire an application?
The human element. Often the most challenging part of any technological transition, and you're absolutely right. We can't just focus on the technical side. We need to think about the people who rely on those applications every day and how this change will impact them.
And thankfully, our source material dedicates an entire chapter to this topic, change management and user transition in application decommissioning.
It's great to see that emphasis because it really highlights how this is not just an IT project. It's an organizational change initiative that needs a well-thought-out and comprehensive approach.
So where do we begin with this change management process?
A good starting point is understanding how application decommissioning can impact users. Our source outlines 4 key dimensions of change impact.
Let's hear them.
First, we have workflow disruption.
Which seems pretty inevitable when you're retiring a system that people use regularly.
It is. People's daily routines will be affected. They might need to learn new processes, use new tools, and adapt to new ways of working.
And that can lead to frustration resistance, even a dip in productivity.
Exactly. So it's crucial to anticipate these disruptions and have strategies to minimize their impact. This might involve providing clear instructions, hands-on training, and dedicated support channels to help users navigate the transition.
Right. We want to make this transition as smooth and painless as possible.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the next dimension, stakeholder psychology.
Okay, so this is about understanding the emotional and psychological responses people might have to the change.
Exactly. People can be very attached to familiar systems and ways of working, even if those systems are no longer efficient or effective.
We're creatures of habit after all.
We are. And change can be unsettling even when it's for the better. So we need to address those psychological factors head on.
How do we do that?
Communication is key. Clearly explain the reasons behind the decommissioning, the benefits it will bring, and how users will be supported throughout the transition. It's also important to acknowledge and address any concerns users might have about the change.
So we're not just telling people what's going to happen, we're explaining why it's happening and what it means for them.
Exactly. And that brings us to the third dimension, knowledge transfer.
This is about making sure that the knowledge and expertise associated with the decommissioned application isn't lost right.
Exactly. Before retiring an application, we need to capture all that valuable knowledge. The business rules, the workflows, the troubleshooting tips, all that institutional memory that is built up over time.
And how do we go about capturing all of that?
We have several options. We can document processes, create training materials, hold knowledge-sharing sessions, or even pair up experienced users with new users to facilitate mentoring and knowledge transfer.
And this becomes even more critical when dealing with applications that have been around for a while and have a lot of that tribal knowledge associated with them.
Absolutely. You don't want to lose all that expertise when you retire the application.
Right. Okay, so we've covered workflow disruptions, stakeholder psychology, and knowledge transfer. What's the fourth dimension of change impact?
The fourth dimension is cultural adaptation.
So this is about how the change impacts the overall culture of the organization.
Exactly. New systems often require new ways of working, which can lead to shifts in team dynamics, communication patterns, and even power structures within the organization.
And those shifts can be disruptive if they're not managed effectively.
Absolutely. So it's important to anticipate these cultural changes and develop strategies to facilitate a smooth transition. This might involve things like team building activities, communication workshops, or even leadership training to help managers adapt to the new ways of working.
So we're not just focusing on individual users, we're thinking about the impact on the entire organization.
Exactly. Change management and application decommissioning is a holistic process that needs to address the needs of individuals, teams, and the organization as a whole.
Okay, so we've talked about the four dimensions of change impact. What are some practical steps organizations can take to manage this change effectively?
Our source material provides a helpful transition framework that outlines 3 key phases of implementation.
Okay, let's walk through those phases.
The first phase is preparation. This is where we lay the groundwork for a successful transition. We start by conducting a stakeholder analysis to identify everyone who will be impacted by the change. Then we assess the impact of the change on workflows, processes, and systems. And finally, we develop a comprehensive communication plan to keep all stakeholders informed throughout the entire process.
So we're doing a lot of upfront planning and analysis in this phase.
Exactly. The more prepared we are, the smoother the transition will be. The second phase is execution. This is where we actually start rolling out the changes. We deliver targeted communications to different stakeholder groups, provide training and support to users, and establish feedback mechanisms to gather input and address any concerns.
So this is where the rubber meets the road.
It is, and it's important to have a dedicated team in place to manage this execution phase. And finally, we have the stabilization phase.
This is about ensuring the new systems and processes are adopted and that users are comfortable and productive. Right.
Exactly. We need to continue monitoring performance, gathering feedback, and making any necessary adjustments to optimize the transition.
So it's not a set it and forget it process.
Yeah,
We need to actively manage the change even after the initial implementation is complete.
absolutely. Change management is an ongoing process that requires continuous attention and refinement.
Okay, so we've talked about the different phases of implementation.
Hmm.
Are there any other key considerations for successful change management in application decommissioning?
One really important thing is to celebrate successes along the way. Acknowledge the efforts of the team and the progress that's been made. This helps maintain momentum and keeps everyone engaged and motivated.
That's a great point. It's easy to get bogged down in the challenges of change, but celebrating those wins along the way can make a big difference.
Absolutely. And finally, I would say it's crucial to be flexible and adaptable. No matter how well you plan, there will always be unexpected challenges and roadblocks. The key is to be able to adjust your plans as needed and keep moving forward.
So don't be afraid to deviate from the plan if the situation calls for it.
Exactly. Change management is an iterative process, and the most important thing is to be responsive to the needs of your users and your organization.
It definitely sounds like decommissioning can be a catalyst for positive change.
It really can be. It's about clearing out the clutter, making room for new growth, and creating a more vibrant and healthy ecosystem for your applications.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the strategic and technical aspects of decommissioning, but what about the practical side of things? What are some common challenges organizations bump into when they actually start putting these decommissioning projects into action?
Yeah, that's where things can get a little tricky. Even with the best plans and intentions, there are always those unexpected obstacles that seem to pop up along the way.
Right, because real life rarely follows the script perfectly.
It rarely does.
So what are some of the most common challenges that organizations face?
One of the biggest, I think, is just getting started.
Okay,
Organizations might be overwhelmed by the sheer number of applications they have, or they might not even know where to begin.
that makes sense.
Mm.
It's like staring at a messy garage. You need to clean it up.
Yeah.
But the task just seems so daunting that you don't even know where to start.
Exactly. And then there's the challenge of securing the necessary resources, both financial and human, to actually support the decommissioning effort.
Right, because decommissioning takes time, effort, and expertise. It's not something you can just squeeze in during your lunch break.
Absolutely. You need dedicated resources to properly assess those applications, develop the decommissioning plans, manage the data migration, and provide that support to users during the transition.
And I imagine those resources can be hard to come by, especially in organizations that are already stretched thin.
They can be, which makes getting buy-in from leadership absolutely crucial. Leaders need to understand the value of decommissioning and be willing to invest the necessary resources to make it happen.
That makes sense. So we've got getting started and securing resources. What other challenges are there?
Managing risk is a big one.
Okay.
Decommissioning projects can introduce a lot of risk, especially if they're not planned and executed carefully.
Right. There's always that potential for data loss, system downtime, or security breaches if things aren't handled properly.
Exactly. So organizations need to be very aware of those risks and develop those strategies to mitigate them. It's like planning a hiking trip. You need to pack the right gear, know the terrain, and be prepared for unexpected challenges along the way.
Okay, so getting started, securing resources, managing risk, those are some pretty big challenges. What are some others?
Dealing with resistance from stakeholders is another common hurdle.
Right. Change can be tough,
It can be.
and people can get very attached to their familiar systems and processes,
They do.
even if those systems aren't really serving them well anymore.
Exactly. So it's crucial to engage stakeholders early and often throughout the entire decommissioning process. Communicate clearly, address their concerns, and build that buy-in for the change.
So it's about bringing people along on the journey and making sure they feel heard and supported.
Exactly. And that change management piece, I think, becomes even more critical when you're dealing with widely used applications or those that are supporting mission-critical business processes.
Absolutely. In those cases, you need a really solid change management strategy to ensure a smooth transition and minimize disruptions to the organization.
Couldn't agree more. It's about minimizing those bumps in the road and making that transition as seamless as possible for everyone involved.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges organizations face when they're decommissioning applications. What are some strategies for overcoming those challenges and really setting yourself up for success?
One of the most important things, I think, is to approach decommissioning strategically.
Okay.
Don't treat it as just another IT project. Treat it as a strategic business initiative.
Right, because it's about aligning those technology investments with the overall business goals.
Exactly. Start by developing a clear decommissioning strategy that outlines your goals, objectives, and your overall approach. This strategy should be aligned with your broader IT strategy, and it should have the full support of senior leadership.
So we're laying the foundation for success from the very beginning.
Exactly. And then once you have that solid strategy in place, you can start to develop a roadmap for implementation. This roadmap should identify the applications you're targeting, the timeline for completion, the resources you'll need, and those mitigation strategies for any potential risks.
So it's like creating a detailed project plan with clear milestones and responsibilities.
Exactly. We're breaking down the decommissioning effort into manageable chunks and making sure everyone's on the same page.
And it's important to prioritize those decommissioning efforts, right?
Absolutely. You want to focus on the applications that will deliver the biggest impact, the ones that are most costly to maintain, that provide the least business value, or that pose the greatest risk to the organization.
So it's about being strategic and focusing on the areas where you can achieve the biggest wins.
Exactly. And as you gain experience and build momentum, you can tackle those more complex decommissioning projects.
So we've talked about approaching decommissioning, strategically developing a roadmap, and prioritizing efforts. What are some other tips for success?
Well, one thing that's always crucial is to establish clear communication channels and keep all stakeholders informed throughout the entire process.
Right, because communication is key in any project, especially one that involves so much change.
Absolutely. You need to clearly explain the rationale for decommissioning, the benefits it will bring, and how users will be supported throughout that transition. And you need to be responsive to stakeholder concerns and address any issues that arise in a timely and transparent manner.
So it's about building trust and buy-in through open and honest communication.
Exactly. And I would also emphasize the importance of documentation.
Documentation, what do you mean by that?
Document every decision made throughout the process, the steps taken, the challenges encountered, and the lessons learned. This documentation becomes incredibly valuable for future decommissioning projects, compliance audits, and for knowledge transfer within the organization.
Well, it's like creating a playbook for future decommissioning efforts.
Exactly. We're capturing all those valuable insights and making sure they're accessible to everyone who needs them. And finally, I would say be patient and persistent.
Okay.
Decommissioning isn't a quick fix.
Right.
It's an ongoing process that takes time, effort, and commitment. But the benefits, both in terms of cost savings and improved business agility, are well worth it.
So it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a journey, and it's one that can lead to a much healthier and more efficient IT landscape for your organization.
Okay, so we've explored the challenges and the strategies for successful application decommissioning. As we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key message you want our listeners to take away?
I think the key message is that decommissioning is a strategic imperative for any organization that's looking to thrive in today's digital age. It's not just about getting rid of old technology. It's about making smart choices that align technology with business goals and create a more agile, secure, and cost-effective IT environment.
It's about creating that solid foundation for innovation and growth.
Exactly. By thoughtfully managing your application portfolio and embracing decommissioning as an ongoing process, you can free up resources, reduce risks, and unlock the potential for incredible new opportunities. So take a look at your application landscape and ask yourself, what could we achieve if we started treating our applications like assets with life cycles?
That is such a great question for our listeners to ponder. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you found this exploration of application decommissioning valuable and insightful.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.